Portland's podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Evans, and today I'm joined by two veterans in logistics and freight management, Chris Schramm, Director of Solutions at Nexterus, and Justin Lipsky, founder of FirstLink. So every product on a store shelf took a journey to get there, right? And right now, that journey is a lot more complicated, a lot more expensive, and a lot more uncertain than it's been in a generation. Between the Supreme Court ruling that reshuffled the U.S. tariff policy overnight, an energy shock tied to the war in the Middle East, and freight costs that would make your eyes water, the global supply chain is being stress tested in real time right now. Chris and Justin, they're here to break down what that means for businesses, consumers, and anyone trying to plan more than 6 months ahead. So, welcome to the show, you guys.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. So, let's start with a quick introduction. Justin, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit.
Sure. So, yeah, like you said, my name is Justin Lipsky, founder of FirstLink. And our company, we work in the field of international procurement. And so essentially what we do, we work out of mainly China, Vietnam, and India. And we help businesses here in the US procure products directly from the manufacturers over there. And so in some cases, those are custom designed products, and we're helping with the product sourcing, factory vetting, that sort of a thing. And in other cases, we are helping to procure materials directly from factories over there, essentially to help companies here save costs on materials.
Okay. Chris?
Sure. Chris Schramm. I am Director of Solutions with Nexterus. We are an 80-year-old privately held logistics management company, fourth generation ownership. So proud of that achievement. I think it's less than 3% of companies ever make it to that level. But we have sustained our business on logistics management and supply chain engineering, expanding obviously into the new world of technology and what we can deliver from supply chain design and modeling and simulation. So we've been handling a global aspect of business. We work with Justin on some of the different areas of international movements, but we have domestic and international departments within our organization as well.
Awesome. All right, so let's dive in. So the Supreme Court, like I mentioned, they struck down that the tariffs in February. Within days, there was a new flat 10% tariff in place under Section 122. For your clients who are trying to actually run a supply chain through all of this, does a ruling like that change anything on the ground, or at some point does this uncertainty just become the norm?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both for the people we work with. Certainly, the tariffs being struck down it was expected by many people, I would say, in the trade industry. And in this case, it resulted in a reduction of tariffs for the vast majority of countries that we'd be importing from. So we work a lot out of Asia, so a lot of those countries had tariffs of between 15 and 20%, and now they're down to 10%. So that certainly is a welcome disruption, I would say, compared to what we saw in 2025. So all in all, maybe a reduction of between 5 and 10%, depending on where people were importing from. And I think that's something that, we understand may not last for, beyond the next 6 months or so. We know the administration is working to rebuild the tariffs that they had before using other mechanisms. So I think there's a little bit of a sort of holding pattern here before anyone is going to be considering maybe reducing pricing to their customers based on the costs they're seeing now, because we understand there's still maybe more uncertainty to come.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree, Justin. The impacts and that uncertainty across the board really just causes pause, right? When there's so much change happening, you go from the tariffs in place to overnight those tariffs removed, and then you start the pullback, right? As the media kind of puts that out there and everyone sees that, it doesn't really have that impact on the bottom line for customers until we start seeing like the customs actually starting to grant those rebates coming back in the tariffs, and then obviously anything new at the lower tariff level seeing, do we make a change? Do we make an adjustment to what we're doing now? Do we buy a bunch like we did before? But when we knew the tariffs were coming, do we buy and stock up a bunch and get the warehouse full? And that's really a dynamic that the businesses are struggling with. A lot of companies don't have the data they haven't kind of put that in place from a modeling standpoint to have the data to tell them what should we do if this happens. And no one really had that modeled out. So you're kind of in a dilemma right now of, do I want to react to this situation, or do I want to start planning for, if this happened again in the future, what would we have in place for those processes? So it's definitely a dilemma they're in right now.
Yeah, and you mentioned the rebates, and it's true. And these the Section 122 tariffs are also being challenged by the courts, and so it's the same
Right.
thing. It's people don't know if they're paying the tariffs now. Will there be rebates later if they get invalidated? And CBP, they're still working on the rebate process, but essentially when you have a shipment that clears customs, so Customs and Border Protection, they have up to, I believe it's 315 days to what they call liquidate that entry, which is where they essentially officially, you pay the tariffs when the entry or when the products clear the port, but up to 315 days later, CBP will be reviewing it before they give a final sort of ruling, and you can actually close that off your books. And so, the tariffs that were in place last year, any rebates that will be coming, they may not actually the importers may not actually see that until the entry liquidates, which could be up to 315 days later. And then it's the same thing for things that are coming now with these Section 122 tariffs. It could be another 315 days before people get rebates, if there are going to be rebates for that. So, like I said, there's still a lot up in the air for sure.
Yeah, it seems that way. What happens to these contracts and financing arrangements that were already built on the original rules?
So that it can vary, and a lot of that is because how people structure their contracts with suppliers can vary so much. There are certainly cases where people will essentially, when they're importing, um, kind of work on what we might think of as like spot pricing. So we're not having prices locked in with a contract. We're buying a container here, a container there, and it's just what the prices are. Especially if you're working commodities, but even sometimes for finished products, because the suppliers, they're upstream suppliers that are providing them the materials, those prices can be changing. So sometimes you have things like that where there's not really too much in the way of sort of contractual structure. And then in other cases, you do have contracts in place, and it can depend on if those specify who's paying the tariffs and who isn't. Often that'll come down to who's doing the shipping. If you're doing like FOB terms where the importer is managing the shipping and the importing, typically they're going to be on the hook for whatever the tariffs are. And at the same time, when tariffs go down, that's good for them. If the supplier is handling the shipping and you've agreed on let's say a landed price, and the supplier is handling that, well, if tariffs drop, now the supplier gets the benefit, or the risk if tariffs go back up from that. So it can depend a lot on what the structure is.
And it can also, Michelle, it can also be, industry specific too, as far as the impact. So depending on, if you're a manufacturer here in the United States and you're relying on raw goods and the commodities that are coming across from a certain area that are getting hit with a higher tariff, then you may want to look at sourcing from somewhere else if you're able to do that, if you've kind of thought through that already. And that's where Justin's team would be able to come into play and say, hey, we're getting it from here and we're getting hit with the higher tariffs. Now that these have changed, the dynamic of our financing is going to have impacts there, because we could have savings over here. So if we can source from another area and bring that in at a lower cost point, then that kind of can drive us into not only an individual reaction to the situation with the tariffs today, but also long term, giving yourself options that you're not just sourcing from one spot on a regular basis, that you can have multiple options to be flexible in these kinds of changes.
Yeah, that was definitely something we saw a lot of last year, where a lot of people that were buying things out of China, and then they got hit with the 100+% tariffs, and all of a sudden everyone was looking at other options. So that's definitely what people call the China plus one strategy, but just in general, looking at options to, you know, diversify the supply chain, have a backup supplier, sort of, get that set now while things are not so bad, so that if there are more disruptions, you already know, where you can go for other options.
Yeah. Yeah, you you mentioned how chaotic 2025 was with the tariffs. Now we're only into 2026. What's this month? March? 3 months now. Would you say that things have genuinely stabilized, or you think businesses have just gotten a little better with living with that chaos and being prepared?
I would say we're in a much more stable position compared to 2025. 2025, was it about, I think it was April, that the so-called Liberation Day tariffs hit, and those were, I think, a huge shock to a lot of people. And there was, a multi-month period where you really one day to the next did not know what the tariffs were going to be. In some
Right.
cases, they seemed to be based on some sort of, larger economic policy. In other cases, I remember on Canada, there was a political ad placed on a TV station, and that resulted in threats of tariff increases. So you really had no idea, and it made it very difficult to plan. But I think now we're in a place where most likely the tariffs that were in effect before the Supreme Court ruling, those are probably about the ceiling of what we could expect. I mean, that seemed to be what the
Okay.
administration wanted, and where we are right now is maybe the floor on the low end. So that's what I would say. And Chris, you may see more. You talk to a lot of customers and industries as well.
Sure. It kind of, I would agree with you, Justin. It definitely has settled down. The war, obviously, we got right to the point of settled down to consistency where everyone was kind of feeling comfortable where we were, and then we have the war that hits. And the war seemed to hit almost overnight, and right away you have these increases that come into play, and you've got the fuel kind of driving some of that. So what was there, as consistency now just has another disruption. And if anything, the pandemic taught us that disruptions we need to be ready for. We need to plan
Yeah.
those out. And the companies that were, proactive in doing that, that started to look at during the pandemic, the post-pandemic era that we've been in, started to look at their data, started to look at how do we navigate these things instead of just having to be reactive when a bomb drops. How do we actually, navigate this so that we protect our businesses and work through it in a way that takes us out the backside of it in a positive light, when we kind of look to what has happened in the last couple months here as we've started off 2026, what looked to be, as the economists had looked at fourth quarter 2025 as they were projecting out 2026, a lot of them were saying, if it stays the same as 2025, don't be shocked. It's going to be identical to what 2025 looked like. And then we started 2026 off prior to the war, and everyone started to have a little bit more of a positive outlook because the
Right.
economy was kind of coming back. There were the tariffs had stabilized, so we kind of had a picture of what could be growth in 2026. And then the war happens, and all of a sudden we're back up into upheaval and chaos, and what else are we going to have to navigate through? So there seems to be a constant, and that's the world of freight. We always have changes that are happening, whether they're good or bad, changes that are happening that impact the businesses, and we have to be ready for those navigations of how do we as businesses actually move forward and come out on the back end in a positive light.
Yeah. You mentioned the war and how all this stuff is creating this upheaval. The Strait of Hormuz has effectively been closed since late February, which is roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil moving through one very tense little corridor. For a business that doesn't think of themselves as an energy company at all, why should this keep them up at night?
Yeah, Chris, I think that's a great question for you because I'm often, when it comes to fuel prices and how that affects shipping, I'm asking you guys in freight forwarders to tell me. So
Sure.
that's probably you work on the front end of that.
Sure. It would keep them up at night because it's not just so with that being closed and with that kind of impact of the oil not reaching its destinations because of the shutdown there, that impact causes it to kind of flow into different areas, right? So it's not just, a lot of people will look at the price of the pump, right? When you hear about the oil prices, you look at the pump and you say, oh, my gas prices are going up. And that's typically where everybody looks at, but it's not just, the impact is not as a manufacturer or distributor, the impact isn't solely on the transportation portion of it, of getting my trucks that are now going to have higher costs navigating to end users or navigating to my destination points. it impacts across the board. Manufacturing uses oil for more than just the transportation piece of it. So making, if you're using petroleum products in a way that actually manufactures your product, well, that impact can have
Yeah.
devastation on your entire ability to manufacture your product and continue your sales forecasts and get them out the door. So how, as this kind of continues, as this blockade just continues, that continues to have the impact trickle down from people that are importing the goods. You get the impacts of higher costs on your imports. You get higher costs on your domestic transportation, but you also get a delay in your manufacturing process. And that's the part where I think so many times you're lost on just that fuel portion of how the
Yeah.
oil impacts it, and you don't see that this actually impacts how I can actually make products. How do I receive products in that are made with this material, and what does that do to the shelf? When is it going to be available to me? Are we going to have shortages because of those delays in manufacturing? So it's a constant picture of change that happens when something like this occurs. And then you also have, just in the need for that fuel, that it then starts to translate into air freight. So if I can't get it through the seaborne avenue, can I still get it through air freight,
I agree.
which has a significantly higher impact on dollar amounts to actually move product through air?
Yeah, last episode, Bruce and I were talking about the effects that it was having, and he mentioned like flights to Japan were like through the roof. And I was like, I didn't even think about the fact that it's going to affect literally everything at this point.
Yes.
Yeah, a lot of downstream effects. And one thing that's interesting, Chris, you mentioned how the in the manufacturing process in petroleum, based products and that sort of thing. And one thing that people might not think of, but actually we dealt with kind of recently, is polyester, which we think of as a textile or fabric, but polyester is a petroleum-based product. And so, as again those inputs, those costs increases, and you don't think of the price of oil, petroleum affecting, it's for apparel. There are like cleaning cloths made out of. There's even, we recently were working on some quartz countertops, and those are made with a polyester resin, and it's sort of like a glue that holds it together, and it's a a petroleum based product in there. So it's again the downstream effect, especially of something like petroleum. It's like Chris said, it's not just your freight cost or the oil, the gas at the pump. It's really used in so many things that we don't often think of, that it has that downstream effect.
Yeah, that's insane. I never knew about the whole polyester using petroleum. But you kind of touched on this. Basically, like when the oil prices are surging, where do your clients usually feel it first? Is it just in the manufacturing, or is it just in the transportation?
I think it can depend maybe on where people are in the supply chain, so to speak. So let's say if you are in
True.
manufacturing, you're pretty much on that kind of front end. You may be bringing in inputs, manufacturing inputs, materials, that sort of a thing, and so you sort of just feel that effect. But then if you imagine, let's say you're like a regular consumer buying things from a retail store, you've had added costs at the manufacturing stage, the import, the freight stage, the distributors that are trucking that across the country, and they have increased costs now from the oil. So all of those get compounded along the chain. So it's kind of, the further you are downstream of that,
Yeah.
the more likely you are to have higher effects. And then on the flip side, if you're a company and you're looking at your supply chain, the more you can sort of cut out those extra links and kind of go direct as you can to the manufacturing stage. That's the best way that you can minimize the effects of that.
So here's what's interesting right now. You've got tariff pressure and energy shock hitting at the same time. Is it just a double hit, or is this one of those situations where one disruption creates some unexpected cover for the other one?
I think in many cases it's probably a double hit. I do think for the more, you could say creative of salespeople out there, they can probably you know use these types of the more disruptions that are happening, the more cover it can be if you are looking to, let's say, raise prices on your
True.
customers, that sort of a thing. But I think for the people that are actually doing the purchasing or the importing, of these materials. Um, it's the tariffs. Again, certainly they're lower now than they were last year, which is good. But compared to, let's say, before all these new tariffs came in, that, and now you have the the added fuel costs on top of that. It makes it very difficult to have price stability. It makes it difficult to keep your costs down. And then if you are trying to do things in an honest way, you're not trying to be, creative about your pricing there. It does
Yeah.
make it difficult, in how you communicate with your customers and to know when you should or shouldn't raise prices as your costs are going up. I think it's a very challenging situation to be in.
Yeah, I would agree, Justin. I mean, so much of the conversations on businesses through this whole tariff increase has been how do I manage margins in this? How do I still remain profitable and not have to dump all of this additional cost onto my customer base?
Yeah.
Because obviously everyone's still in a competitive environment to where I make a product, someone else makes a similar product, and I'm trying to compete with them on price to keep it on the shelf, but my costs have increased substantially on the back end.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big part of how businesses are looking at what amount can I trickle down to the customer level, the end user level, to still maintain my market share and still compete in my specific area without losing anything on my own side of profitability and keeping that navigated as well as possible. And that's a dynamic that unless a company is actually able to look at their internals, their data, knowing specifics of what is my landing cost of everything coming in the door, what's my sale price have to be to keep my margins. If you're just kind of guessing, or if you've kind of just been in a good spot up until these tariffs where you were profitable, you knew you were making money, but you didn't really have all the dynamics of the granulars of your business, this is where something like this can really make that impact, and you're not sure whether or not you need to adjust prices to your customer level or where you need to adjust those prices. So I would say right now, the combination of the tariffs and the fuel together really is that, to Justin's point, is that double impact on specifically on the businesses that are driving that down to the end user customer, because the end user customer is going to have to pay for, if it's a need, they're going to have to pay for that need, and if everybody kind of is in the same boat that provides that need, you're going to have higher costs to the end user. But you will start to see some of those wants trickle away at the customer level, because it won't be just from a financial standpoint, they won't be able to afford those increases if you put that price too high. So it's a very thin line in navigating how to
Yeah.
manage your inbound costs along with your outbound sales.
It's a tightrope.
Yeah.
So air freight costs reportedly spiked 400% within 48 hours of the war. When a number like that lands, do clients pivot to, like we mentioned, ocean freight? Do they hold the inventory and wait it out? Or do they just kind of suck it up and keep it moving?
Well, I'm in the fortunate position that most of what we do is ocean freight. Anyways, we pretty much
Nice.
only air freight when we're doing samples back and forth. So Chris, you probably have better insight than me on that one.
Sure. Yeah, the air freight spike is actually a translation from the ocean to the air. That's why you have that spike. Air freight is a limited solution in most cases for companies anyway, because of the cost being much higher than the ocean. You're really ordering anything when you're doing imports that are coming in via air. You're typically doing that on an ad hoc needed basis. So it's kind of like those, hey, I need this right now. I can't wait for the 2 weeks for it to set sail and get here. So they're usually emergency shipments because of the cost difference. So the 400% increase doesn't really have, in our visual, it doesn't really have as much of an impact of the actual cost of the shipments, as much as it has an impact on the companies that used to get their product via ocean, needed to get their product quicker, so they're ordering less. So even though that cost goes up, they're not ordering the same amount of product that they were ordering on the ocean vessels. They're just ordering what they need to get by on those air freight shipments. So yes, there is a significant cost increase, but it's a limited volume of shipment that comes over versus what comes over on the boat. So it's not as much. It sounds very drastic
It
in the
does.
400% increase, which it is. I don't want to downplay the fact that that kind of an increase is a drastic increase for most companies. But typically, when they're moving that way, they're doing it because they need the product now and they're willing to pay the additional cost to get it here.
Makes sense. So we mentioned how things look different in each industry. What sectors are you watching closely right now, and what are you seeing when it comes to like freight financing and cost structures?
Yeah, for us, we work in a number of industries, but I would say we're kind of there's no specific areas that, for what I see that are impacted more or less than others, especially now that we're at sort of at least for the time being, a kind of global tariff uh, regime or a system. So there are still, we do look, based on country sometimes, certainly. There are still higher tariffs on China out of many products, and we are keeping a close eye on they call them the Section 301 investigations, which are essentially what the administration is using now to try to recreate tariffs, and those will be country and product specific. So as more details about that come up over the coming months, that's for us more the kind of things that we look for and sort of trying to get ahead of the curve on which countries and which products may have higher or lower tariffs, so that again if people are looking to source those, we can sort of provide guidance on which countries may be the better place to look for at any given time. So that's more the type of thing that we look for.
Okay.
Yeah, we're keeping our eye on domestic manufacturers that do not need to import and what they can do in a competitive environment like this. So if you have a domestic manufacturer that has to import a majority of their raw goods from outside of the country, they're going to have the impacts that are going to be higher because they can't get it as localized and the costs are going to be higher in bringing that over. So that area, if you start to see domestic manufacturers that can source all of their raw materials locally within the domestic U.S., they should have an upper hand on the ones that need to import raw goods. So if you have a competitive environment in domestic U.S. Between companies that are sourcing locally or sourcing internationally, that can drive some of those companies that can get it more localized to have a better sell price and use it to their advantage during this time to be able to get product out the door at a lower price point than what the competitor can.
So yeah, you both work in a lot of different industries. And the supply chain for, say, a pharmaceutical company looks a lot different than one for like a retailer or an auto manufacturer. Can you talk a little bit about how those structures differ and why that matters so much when a disruption like this happens?
Yeah, so we work, a lot in this area where we're essentially, in many cases, we're trying to help companies to sort of streamline their supply chain, and we are looking at right how that's structured, who they're buying from, who their supplier is buying from, and how we can sort of minimize the kind of links along that chain. And it's true for something like, let's say, a pharmaceutical company. They are, essentially they're designing, we could say, their, whatever the drug or the product is, they're they're going and sourcing all of the the chemicals, the ingredients, the materials. They have whatever the sort of assembly process is. You can tell I don't work in the pharmaceutical industry, but using the same terms we would use for other products. But they're essentially they're doing that, right? And then they may be, yes, either importing it, or maybe they're putting it together in the U.S. And then from there they'll be sending it out to their most likely distribution partners, who maybe then will send it on to the retailers. And so again, you have all those sort of links. But from the pharmaceutical company's perspective, they don't need to worry so much about the downstream effects in terms of, like, the when they're structuring
Right.
their supply chain. Mainly they need to worry about, just again, it's they're designing their product, who they're sourcing those from. Obviously they have liability, and they need to make sure they're getting high quality inputs, chemicals, certainly in something like medicine, but that can apply to any other product. Whereas if you're, let's say, on the the retail end, you're sort of the last stop before the end consumer. You're buying, much smaller amounts. You're buying them from a distributor, most likely who's local to your region or your territory. And in many cases, you're buying a brand name, so that brand name kind of carries reputation, and you kind of don't have to worry as much about the quality risk, let's say, as you would if you're the person who's actually
Right.
running that brand and you're the one sourcing all those inputs, and now you really have to make sure that you're doing your compliance and your due diligence. So there's a lot of different things that people have to consider, sort of depending on where you are on that chain, and it can be complicated for all, whether you're the sort of the brand or the pharmaceutical company or you're the retailer. But it's definitely a very different picture, and the disruptions will hit you differently. So again, if you're the retailer, you are sort of at the mercy of, if you're buying from a distributor, let's say, whatever the distributors tell you the prices are, you kind of have to pick and
Right.
choose, and you can try to negotiate, but you don't really have much control over the cost. If you're on the brand side, let's say, and you're designing and having that product manufactured, you are still, you have to deal with the cost of the inputs, things we were just talking about, but you may have a little bit more room then, because you see what the actual costs are of that product, and you can kind of strategize a bit more about how you're going to price things, forecast demand, forecast what you think the tariff, let's say, or in this case with the war and the oil prices, what that's going to look like. And so you can maybe strategize a bit more there, whereas I think, again, the further down you are along that chain, the harder it gets to be to do that, because you're kind of just stuck with whatever your supplier is charging. There's not that
Right.
much you can do about it.
Yeah, to add on that, Michelle, there's also from the transportation side, you'll have companies like a pharmaceutical company that might have a specific requirement of a niche equipment in order to transport. So, like temp control trailers, reefer trailers. So, being able to navigate needing those, so they're a finite, because they're a niche product and not everything moves. Needing refrigeration, they can charge a little bit more for those specific needs of equipment,
Right.
and it can be something as simple as, so that in the pharmaceutical side will drive costs up, just because there's a finite number of reefer trailers on the road for specific lanes, so you need to compete to win that specific reefer trailer to move at that specific time. And when you need to do that, you need to pay a little higher cost, because they can charge that and do. But it could be something as simple as, to Justin's point of, in the retail space versus in the distribution space. Distribution usually goes warehouse to warehouse, so you may have a truck that doesn't need a lift gate tied to that. Well, there's a lower cost involved in that, and moving just straight dry van trucks from warehouse to warehouse, versus a lift gate that's needed to deliver to a residential. So, you have these different parts of equipment that affect the different dynamics of how each one of these industries work as well, specific to that equipment that's needed for them to operate.
Yeah. Most people, when you think of the supply chain, we don't really think that deep into it. There's a lot of invisible things happening behind the scene, from the raw material to the component to the finished product to the distribution center, then to the store. Help us understand, when something like this goes wrong upstream, there's trickle down. But when does the consumer actually feel it? Like, what's the timeline in that?
I think it can vary a lot, and and I think last year was a good example of that, where companies they were trying to figure out, at what point do they have to then pass on the added cost
Yeah.
onto the customer. And the flip side of that is, if costs are going down, and at what point do they reduce prices to the end
Yeah.
consumer. And I think the sort of just reality of how supply chains for the majority of products are now, compared to, let's say, 30, 40 years ago, so many products they are made overseas, and that used to be maybe manufactured in the US, or even for US manufacturers, a lot of inputs are coming from over there. So things have gotten more complicated, for sure. And I think last year, prices, obviously because of tariffs, were going up and then down and then up again, all over the place. And there were some companies that, if they had, let's say, product that was already in the US, they could continue to sell those at, let's say, the same pricing. And then as the new product they were bringing in came and got hit by those higher tariffs, that's when they would sort of start to look at increases. I know some were probably phasing in increases, so they knew they had a set amount of inventory here in the U.S., but they knew that that cost jump was coming quickly, and instead of doing, let's say, a 50% rise in pricing overnight, they wanted to phase that in. So it depends a lot on sort of what companies think is coming sort of around the corner, and what makes that easiest for them to decide is stability. So even if, let's say, tariffs are higher, costs are up, as long as there's stability and people know what to expect, pricing can be increased, decreased, whatever it may be, in a sort of reasonable timeline and a reasonable way. When there's lots of instability and you don't know what it's going to be, now, 6 months from now, a year from now, that's when it gets difficult. And so I think now, we were speaking before about the Section 122 tariffs, the 10%. That's in most cases a reduction in costs, but I would not expect companies to be reducing prices anytime soon, because they know the administration is
It's
working
gonna
to bring those
change.
tariffs back in, even if that's 6 months from now, and they're going to maybe make a bit of an extra profit, let's say, in those 6 months. You still, because companies, like the end consumer, like to keep prices relatively stable. So I think, that, and I will say higher prices tend to be stickier than lower prices, because companies, after all, are profit driven. So that
Yeah.
type of thing does happen as well. So unfortunately, it's often the end consumer that kind of feels the brunt of these things one way or another.
Yeah.
Michelle, I'm sure Justin would agree with me that post-pandemic, I think everyone who was in supply chain was hopeful that the end user customers were more aware of what happens in supply chain. But I think we're
Yeah.
now that we're dealing with these other tariffs and fuel costs and oil costs going up, I think we're still recognizing there's a lot to be learned on still the navigation of what actually happens in getting a product to the shelf for the end user.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'll just add into to what Justin had there is it really does, as I was talking a little before about the wants and needs, it really does come down to that as well. So old school sales 101, supply and demand, right? If the demand for the product is still there, no matter what the price point is, there's always a break point. So when you're looking at the supply that you have and the demand for your product, if that demand is so high that it doesn't matter whether you would raise your price 50% overnight or not, that's still a commodity need for an end user, then they can pass that along rather quickly. So your question was kind of like a timeline of when they'll feel it. Those demand products, you may feel that almost immediately. So as that price point comes, there's companies that will pass that straight along because they know their product is in such high demand that they'll pay that price point. And then obviously you have the opposite side of that, where it's something that's more of a want, your gadgets and your gizmos that people
Yeah.
look at and they say, okay, well, I really don't need to have that. That's more of just it'd be cool to have. Those ones, they can't, those distributors can't make those changes as drastically. So that may be a 3 to 6 month lag time on before the end user actually feels anything from that level.
Yeah, we kind of felt that a couple months ago. My sister is getting married this year, and we were shopping for her dress. And when she got to the register, they were like, "Oh, it's a $350 tariff charge," and I was
Wow.
just like, "What, on the wedding dress? Seriously? It's
Hey, if you love
crazy."
that dress enough, she's going to pay it, right?
And she bought it.
Yep,
Yep.
So that's that needs and wants.
that's right.
That's what it is.
Yep.
Your once in a lifetime wedding. People will pay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Got to get that dress. So, where in that chain does the financing and logistics support become the most critical and honestly the most fragile? Like, what's a vulnerability that doesn't get talked about enough?
I think, Chris, you guys deal with obviously the logistics support a lot. Do you want to maybe take that one?
Sure. I would say the area that probably doesn't get talked the most about would be planning. So many companies are they see what happens, right? You get the media kind of unleashes out very quickly what's going on with tariffs, what's going on with wars, what's going on with fuel. But companies, we still as a whole, companies don't do a great job of planning. They kind of just think that, well, if everything's operating this way, then it's going to remain this way. And Justin kind of mentioned of the consistency that the end users want to have in pricing. Well, it's nice to talk about, But unless you're actually planning through what actually can happen and simulating what can happen to the business model at all levels of the supply chain, not just at the manufacturer, not just at the distributor, even at the end user level, at the retailers that are selling on the shelves, kind of looking at, okay, what does all of these impacts happen? And we still see, even today, we still see so many companies that don't look at their own internal processes and systems and do any kind of critical planning to say, okay, how should I order inventory? When something like this comes up, it's all reactionary instead of proactive. And the companies that actually planned out and knew if something like this happens, this is how we're going to operate, when they have that kind of SOP in place already, they're the ones that are successfully navigating through this because they looked at quickly, were able to take their data, analyze it, and very quickly make the decisions of this is what we'll do in this scenario. And those companies are the ones that you're seeing not really have a whole lot of changes or impacts to their business model because they planned for this. So I would say if you're a company out there and you haven't actually looked at your processes and said, okay, how can, if something changes down the road, and you're not going to know everything. There's going to be a lot of things. I mean, no one really knew that these tariffs would change the way they did. No one knew that we would be in a war and that all of a sudden oil would have this drastic spike. But you can simulate those kinds of things. And if you're already looking at modeling and simulation on the front end, you can do it rather quickly because you'll just take your existing data, put it through a modeling, and say, this is exactly what's going to happen to us, and this is how we need to navigate. So I would say that's an area, and Justin, feel free to chime in on that. I know from just the international side, that's a big part of it too, because we can model, even for like what Justin's doing, we can help out a company like his that's going to go source from other areas international. We can go and look at the data for a shipper and say, hey, this is what you should do. Here's the guys that can go and help you get that done. And then work in a channel partnership with Justin and FirstLink to be able to solve a problem for a client through their data.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think, we're all seeing that planning is becoming so important. And for a lot of companies, like you said, Chris, that maybe in the past have not needed to really take a close look at their supply chain and at, how they respond to things like this. Now, all of a sudden, you do, and it really is the people that are able to go over the data, purchasing cost, all of that, but B, start to plan and kind of just become a little sort of maybe like an amateur supply chain expert kind of a thing, where you're really looking at, okay, what are the products we're buying, even if we're buying from a domestic supplier, where are they buying it from, so that we can start to understand, if their costs are going up, they're going to pass that on to us, so we need to be prepared. And then starting to think about that, look into, okay, now maybe there are other options, other places we can buy from, whether we are buying directly from overseas, or we're just buying from maybe consolidating volume and buying at wholesale in bulk, and what that does. So there's lots of options out there, but I think the key thing is it does take some sort of dedication of time and energy to really look at these things in ways that people maybe didn't have to before.
Yeah, I kind of want to piggyback off of that, the whole planning, because we mentioned the Section 122 tariffs. They are set to expire in July. But Chris, you made a good point about planning ahead. What's something that you would, tell a client to get ahead of all this? Was it just planning, or is it kind of having these doomsday scenarios to work through?
I would say, I mean, you should probably look at your entire workflow process, right? It's not just, if you're not kind of concentrating on total supply chain and how your business functions, like to Justin's point, take it all the way back to not just who you buy from, but who they buy from. Take it back to the starting point of how does if you're manufacturing a product, how does your product get manufactured? Before it gets there, look at your total supply chain. and evaluate it. Put it into a workflow so that you can actually see what's happening with your business. Once you can see what's happening in your business, then you can actually model out the impact areas, right? So it doesn't have to be you don't have to have the doomsday, do everything, cover everything mentality. Really, it's a matter of efficiency, right? Am I doing everything? So if you're currently running efficiently, the impacts are a lot less to your organization when something like this occurs because you've already been operating at an efficient level. If you're operating at just a guesswork level and then something like this happens, now you have no picture of efficiency. You have no picture of corrective action to bring this back into operational workflows that make sense. And that's where we see a lot of the companies that wind up going out of business for these kinds of impacts because they didn't have a plan in place. They didn't know how that was going to affect their business. They didn't have a picture of where they were actually sourcing from or how all of that impacted their specific operation. So if they're able to, and don't get me wrong, there's to Justin's point, there's a workload, there's a resources that needs to come into play here, but you need to be intentional in that. If you're intentional in knowing your workflows and knowing how your business operates through the supply chain, then you can be more specific on where you want to target areas, whether it's a software improvement or it's a workforce improvement, or if it's a facility improvement. If I'm operating in a specific area and it doesn't make sense because my customer base is on the other side of the country, then maybe I should look at a warehouse or a distribution center on the other side of the country. But if you don't know that and you keep on operating just as status quo because you were a small business that grew into a large business, then you're just kind of operating as the world kind of affects all of your business instead of you having control of that.
Yeah, and I would say, don't be afraid to have conversations with your partners along, your supply chain. So certainly, right, if you're working with, Nexterus or a company like them, call them up and you can ask questions about, okay, here's where we're shipping from, or here's where our suppliers, here's where our customers are located. Are there ways we can optimize that? If you're buying from whoever the supplier may be, give them a call and ask them, hey, from your perspective, how are things looking? What's your outlook? Are you anticipating price changes? Where are you buying from? What, just, get a real understanding and, treat all of the people that you're dealing with here along your supply chain as partners. Because ultimately, if you can, nurture a collaborative relationship with them, that's going to be best for everyone. So, I always encourage people to start having those conversations. Ask the other people what they're seeing from their perspective. See if there are ways you can work together on things. Maybe there are, optimizations you can come up with together. So just, start talking to people about these things and having those conversations.
That's awesome. Thank you guys for joining me today.
Thank
I
you. This was
really
great.
appreciate it. Why don't you let people know how they can connect with you if they want to talk more about this?
Sure. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Justin Lipsky on there. Website firstlinkpartners.com, or feel free to shoot me an email, justin@firstlinkpartners.com.
Chris?
And you can reach us at Nexterus, Nexterus.com. You can contact through the company there. And then obviously you can reach out to me directly at Schramm at Nexterus.com.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
If you want more insights like this, member news, and information about upcoming events, visit WTCI.org and follow us on all social channels at WTC Institute. Until next time.